I'm Bob Pine. I'm chair of the NRWA's Climate Impact Committee. This talk is co-sponsored by the NRWA, the National Squanicook and Nissitissit Rivers Wild and Scenic Stewardship Council. And it is a delight to have Emma Gildesgame here as our speaker today. Emma is a climate adaptation scientist for the Nature Conservancy of Massachusetts. She's going to discuss how nature-based solutions can help reduce climate-fueled stormwater pollution, strategies for building equity into climate adaptation, and how we plan adaptation projects to bring multiple benefits to people and to nature. Emma works with communities and other partners to keep people and nature safer from the impacts of climate change. She's spent many years thinking about and studying water and people, and how water and people can work better together. That's the nature of this, of the National River Watershed Association, by the way. Especially in cities and other developed areas. She earned a Master's of Environmental Management and Water Resources Science and Management from the Yale School of Environment and a BA in Environmental Science from Colby College.
So, hi everybody. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be joining you all today. So we've got a pretty small group here in the room today, and so I'm really happy to kind of take questions as they come up. I guess Bob and Wynn, if you guys see questions that seem really like connected to exactly what I'm talking about, feel free to pop in and just say, hey, we have a question to talk about. We'll talk about a whole bunch of different things, but I'm happy to dive in deeper to one thing or another if that's what people are interested in. So we'll start with kind of what I call the mission statement for my job. So I work with communities and partners to co-develop and implement nature-based solutions that provide multiple benefits to people and nature at a pace and scale that matches the urgency of climate change. So that is a lot of buzzwords. And we're going to kind of dive into each of those through this presentation today. But really, this means that I end up playing really different roles on really different projects. And so in all the projects that I'm talking about today, I'm not doing any of this work single-handedly. I'm working with partners. Sometimes I'm bringing the technical kind of science expertise and lessons from similar projects across the TNC network to implement local projects. Sometimes I'm bringing management capacity and kind of logistics and coordination to help bring all the partners to the table who need to be there. But it all ties back to the skills that it takes to get nature-based solutions on the ground in ways that really benefit the communities that surround where these nature-based solutions are going. And this is really aligned with the direction that the Nature Conservancy is going. So we are a global organization. For a long time, our bread and butter has been land conservation. And we still do a ton of land conservation. But really, our mission has shifted to really recognize the fact that people and nature can't be separated. That for people to thrive and for nature to thrive, we have to do it together. And that climate change is a major threat to both people and nature. And so one of our 2030 goals is to have 100 million people worldwide benefiting from nature to adapt to climate change. And that's a huge number, but we work in 50 states and more than 70 countries. So actually, it's pretty achievable. And the idea is have nature be an important part of the solution. And we have a really good legacy, not just as the Nature Conservancy, but as environmental organizations and environmentalists, of making really, really good progress. And we've done a lot of incredible work. So you probably recognize this picture because I took it from your website. But in the 60s, our rivers, the Nashua River, but pretty much most rivers, were just open sewers. They were just places where point sources, factories, actual sewers other just direct dumping created these monumentally polluted, unlivable, just downright dangerous waters. And thanks to the Clean Water Act, a lot of advocacy, a lot of good science, rivers around the country are in dramatically better shape than they once were. And that's the kind of change that we need on climate adaptation. And there's work that is happening all over the country and across the Northeast that really is showing promise that we can do something similar. And when it comes to water quality, there's still a lot of work to be done. So right now, most of the work that needs to be done is not, let's take this river that is running red and make it watercolored. But it's much more, how do we reduce point sources? So pollution that is not easy to say, oh, let's turn off this one tap of pollution, but pollution where we have to work across a watershed to do it. And when it comes to climate change and water quality, they're so linked in that we can address these at a watershed scale really, really effectively. And working on one benefits the other. And so my work is mostly in Massachusetts. So my climate data that I usually pull comes from Massachusetts, but the New Hampshire part of the Natural River Watershed is not that different from the Massachusetts part. So we're just going to go with these numbers. So basically what we're seeing in the Northeast is the extremes are becoming the norm. And especially when it comes to precipitation, as Bob mentioned, I'm a water person, always been a water person. So I think about things in terms of water. But if you look at the annual change in precipitation, we're not seeing that big of a change. But when you start to look at it seasonally, that's when you start to see this split. And so that's where you start to see more drought-ridden summers where we have longer periods without rain and a massive increase. This dark blue is 24 to 40% increase in precipitation annually by 2070. And so that means more and more of our rain coming as these dramatic rainfall events, because it'll be rain, not snow most of the time, downpouring on potentially frozen ground that leads to dramatic floods, both stormwater floods and rivers overtopping their banks. And so that's really heavily reflected in the #1 most urgent infrastructure impact that Massachusetts is projecting from climate change is damage to buildings. These are homes and businesses and public spaces. And the projections are that by 2050, there might be an increase. So not that long from now, like 25 years from now, a little more, we can have a 44% increase in inland residential property damage. This is people's homes. So this is urgent. It takes time to work on infrastructure. We're also going to see a reduction in clean water supply because of groundwater recharge changes and because of kind of stormwater flooding. So there's real problems associated with these dramatic changes in rainfall. And this tracks with the major impacts that we're going to see from climate change that we already are. We need to stop talking about climate change as future tense. It's here. The biggest changes that we are seeing, a lot of them have to do with the ways that we've short-circuited our water cycle. And so, as I'm sure all of you know, when we pave over the ground, it can't act like a sponge anymore. And then all of a sudden, that really intense rainfall is getting shunted almost instantly in some cases to rivers and lakes and all of our surface water. And it's carrying with it all of the pollutants that are sitting around on the ground. And that's leading to flooding and erosion. Same thing's happening on the coast, but sea level rise and extreme coastal storms are doing it. But that system also shortcuts our groundwater recharge. And so when we have drought, that drought is significantly worse than it otherwise would have been because we haven't been building our resilience to drought by allowing groundwater to percolate in and recharge the aquifers. When we allow and we encourage that water to percolate into the groundwater and recharge aquifers, we're also giving it more time to process out, especially things like nutrients that are major pollutants when they hit the water. But if they take more time before they actually reach surface water, more of it gets processed out by the environment, and we have cleaner water in general. And so those all are really obviously connected to water. Too much, not enough. But heat is also really, really closely connected to the ways that we've short-circuited our water cycles by paving everything. And this is not a model, this is real data that volunteers collected. They went out summer of, I want to say it was 2020. I meant to look it up and then I didn't put it in my notes. But actual volunteers went out on cars and by foot and by bicycle with temperature loggers. And if you look at the places that are most heavily paved, Somerville is the most densely populated city in the Northeast. We're mostly pavement. We're like 77% impervious cover. It's hot. If you look at the Middlesex Fells, which is a beautiful forested park, up here, it's much cooler. If you look at Fresh Pond, also a little cooler. It's still pretty paved. Even if you look at Belle Isle Marsh, which is just a little pocket of marsh surrounded by really dense development, it brings cool spaces. So as we get more and more dangerous heat, the things that we can do to protect ourselves from flooding and to recharge our groundwater supplies are the same things that we can do to address really, really dramatic increases in heat. So really, nature is a critical part of the solution. And so nature-based solutions, I think most of you on this call are familiar with this. If you're on this committee, I'm sure you guys talk about it. But just so we're all on the same page, it's a massive toolbox of different ways to work with natural systems and processes to solve problems in ways that benefit both people and the environment. So sometimes this means conserving existing natural systems like salt marshes or wetlands. Sometimes it means restoring really degraded ecosystems to natural functions. So things like riparian buffer areas in really densely developed areas. And sometimes they're more engineered systems that if you think about infrastructure on a gradient from green to gray, that are closer to the middle of that, where you're incorporating really kind of hard engineered landscapes with green nature, green and natural elements. So this is like these rain gardens where you're capturing and treating stormwater, you're helping it percolate, even in a place where you don't have space to protect a giant wetland, or where you don't have a riparian buffer area that you can restore. So nature-based solutions are this toolbox, and it means that you have to tailor it to where you are. So we've learned as a society, I hope, that one-size-fits-all solutions really don't fit anybody. You can plop a coal plant anywhere you want. It's not going to necessarily work out very well for the people who live next to it or our climate, but you can put a coal plant anywhere you want and you can get power. If you want to put solar or wind or other renewable energy sources, you have to be responsive to the ecosystem where you are. And you have to think about what is the context of the solution that I'm putting here, and how can I make sure that this solution fits into the landscape that we're putting it in. And so that is what the work I'm doing does. And so this is Mill Creek. I love talking about Mill Creek because you can see exactly what's happening hydrologically from Google Earth. This is just Google Earth. This isn't like fancy satellite images. This is Google Maps. You too can go look at Google Maps of Chelsea Creek and Mill Creek. So this is the city of Chelsea. This is Revere. If you went just down off the bottom of my screen, you would be at the airport, essentially, at Logan. So this is a very densely developed area. The entire city of Chelsea is classified as an environmental justice area with a really vibrant community of relatively recent immigrants to the US, really, really high population of people for whom English is not their first language, and a lot of industrial waste, a lot of legacy pollutants, and a lot of current pollutants where just massive environmental justice is happening in and around Chelsea, and continuing to have impacts on the people who live there today. So if you look at Chelsea, it's a pretty tiny area. So there's Chelsea Creek, which is right here in kind of the bottom of my screen. I'm not sure how well you can see my mouse, but it's there. Chelsea Creek flows into the Mystic River. The Mystic River, it meets the Mystic River right before it goes into the Boston Harbor. And Chelsea Creek takes a very sharp left, which may or may not have been the direction it originally went, but it takes a very sharp left, and it goes up into these salt marshes. And so this creek is tidal. It's really influenced by the Boston Harbor, but you can see it's heavily constricted. So each of these arrows, well, these two arrows are constrictions. So this is an MBTA bridge. The bridge itself is likely going to get regularly flooded at some point within the next couple of decades, but it's constricting tidal flow. It's causing a lot of sediment to get dropped. It's going up to this used to be a spice mill. So you can see the kind of the uppermost arrow used to be a spice mill, and there was a dam associated with that spice mill. It's no longer a dam. It's very much breached, but it's still causing this major tidal restriction. You can see again, tons of sediment getting dropped out upstream of it. And then we get to these actual salt marshes. These are real, these are salt marshes sitting right next to the Revere Beach Parkway in the middle next to this is Home Depot. You can see it's bright orange. Right next to a Home Depot parking lot, there is salt marsh in the middle of Chelsea Creek, but it is sad salt marsh. It is trying so hard to be salt marsh. It is not getting enough salt water. It is very Phragmites full. Here's the cat that I predicted would show up at some point. He'll be back. But so a lot of the work that we're doing is figure out how do you remove these constrictions and restore tidal flow. Because the idea is you restore tidal flow, you help these marshes be stronger and healthier, you help them be more of a solution to stormwater flooding, help them filter more water so that you have fewer pollutants in the surface water. The thing is, you can't just come in and say, we are here, we are going to remove your tidal restrictions, and then everything will be better. So what we've been doing is we have been partnering with a whole bunch of different entities to figure out how do we do this well, and how do we make sure that we're centering community priorities and local knowledge. So bringing in the science and engineering is pretty standard. What happens, so this picture will come back up later. You can see this is the MBTA bridge. The T is replacing this bridge. They're going to elevate it. They're going to remove some of the pilings. But this is also an abandoned lithograph factory. The city of Chelsea has been an incredible partner in figuring out how do we transform Mill Creek and how do we do it in ways that serve the community that already lives in Chelsea. And so how do we partner with environmental justice organizations like Green Roots, with watershed associations like the Mystic River Watershed Association, with scientists and engineers. They're currently doing a project with MIT to figure out how do you build indigenous knowledge into restoration activities in Mill Creek. And so it's not just we are the scientists, we have the planners, we're good. It's how do you make sure that we're centering local knowledge in all of the work that we're doing. And so this has meant a whole bunch of community engagement. This is a park that the city of Chelsea acquired a vacant lot right next to the creek. You can sort of see, oops, sorry, 1 second, we're going back. You can sort of see on this printout map, this green dot is right next to where the park is. So they're turning this abandoned lot basically into a park, but working with the community to figure out what do you actually want to see from that park, so that it's, and not at the end, hey, what do you think of this design? But we talked about stormwater with this very fun watershed model. You can actually see in this picture some of these opportunities for people to tell us what they wanted. just sitting on the table. And we had the consultants, the environmental scientists at the event. We had the city planners at the event. This was very early in the event when I took pictures. Later on, I was too busy doing the watershed model to actually take pictures. So this is early on, but people who live in the community were coming by and saying, what are you guys doing? I hear you're giving out free pizza. And the answer was yes, we're giving out free pizza and we're talking about what you want to see in a park. And so, you know, how would you like to use Mill Creek? And so people gave us a whole bunch of answers. You will notice that it's a different handwriting saying pool and trampoline. We had some kids come by who felt very strongly that we have a pool and a trampoline. Unfortunately, we aren't going to be able to get that for the kids, but biking, fishing, walking and running, boating, relaxing was a really, really big one that people wanted. And we're going to be able to build that into what the plans for the park are. And so it's this balancing act of how do you see what the communities want, what people who live in the neighborhood actually are going to use the space for, how it can benefit them, and also how can you build green infrastructure into these solutions. So these are plans that Horsley Witten did in 2019 to help support the Mill Creek restoration. We also have a bunch of mosquito ditches that now are mosquito ditches because they're breeding mosquitoes. Great job, past humans. They were, the idea was drain the marsh and then we won't have mosquitoes anymore. It turns out you just get ditches where mosquitoes like to breed. Oops. But it's how do you restore this marsh using community spaces that communities can access and use the way they want to. And these, you know, sidewalk, bioswale, rain garden situations. So bringing the communities in from the beginning makes sure that we can also find out where the biggest stormwater flooding is. I can make a model in GIS and say, I think it probably floods here the most. But my model in GIS is never going to be nearly as good as talking to the people who live there and saying, hey, when it rains, where does it flood? When you have a really hot day, where's the coolest space in the neighborhood? Because communities know, and starting from a place of communities know gets us to way better solutions than when we walk in and say, we're the experts. And so this is something that we know from a whole bunch of our projects, that you have to be able to walk in and say, hey, what do you guys know? You have to show that you're actually going to listen to that knowledge, right? You can't just say, hey, tell me the things you know, and have people trust you. You have to build that trust. You have to find the trusted messenger. You have to really build trust and partnership over time. And it takes so much more time than you think, than we're used to saying, oh yeah, we can do this like this. And when you take more time, you can get to those creative solutions that may not always be fully green, but they'll also be better than the kind of gray infrastructure solutions that might have come up otherwise. So we've kind of honed this approach with a lot of input from a lot of partners and a lot of patience from a lot of partners. And we are moving to a different part of the state and also part of New Hampshire to do an equitable and inclusive update to the Merrimack River Conservation, the Merrimack Watershed Conservation Plan. Many of you have probably seen this before. This is a plan that's used to direct funding, grant funding from the Merrimack Conservation Partnership to nonprofits and partners across the watershed to implement projects that help keep the Merrimack cleaner. And the challenge is that the original 2014 goal plan was really focused on land protection. And land protection is really important. But almost from the day that this was published, the partnership knew that the gaps were really important and that they needed to be able to fill the gaps. So here's kind of all of the developed areas in the watershed are grayed out of this map. And we know that for the Merrimack, for all the other rivers that have really, really strong development around them, that what happens in the cities really, really matters for water quality. This is where stormwater flooding picks up most of their pollutants. It's where stormwater flooding is most urgently or most quickly shunted into either combined sewers that lead to combined sewer overflows, which is definitely the case in the Merrimack, or just flows directly to surface water. So keeping these areas out of the plan not only excludes the people who live there, but also keeps us from reaching our goals. And so they knew that this was a gap. And so they asked the Nature Conservancy to help figure out how to do this better. So for the 2024 update, we are going to figure out how to do land conservation planning in a way that is inclusive and community-centered and equitable. And so we're bringing multiple benefits. We're addressing stormwater pollution. We're addressing urban heat islands. We're really doing meaningful engagement to find out what do people in these communities want and care about. And that's how we're going to do an equity-focused approach. And we also really want to make sure that this is not going to be something that's just like a pretty map that we put out into the world, but that as part of this process, we're identifying barriers and challenges to actually implementing the projects, especially in environmental justice communities, and also identifying opportunities to overcome those challenges. So if we zoom in, we are focusing on Manchester, Nashua, Lowell, and Lawrence. And we know that that's not all of the cities. We chose those 4 as our focal because they're large, they're diverse, and we're hoping that what we learn in those cities will actually be able to get translated into spatial data and maps that we can apply to all the developed areas in the watershed. Recognizing that talking to 4 communities won't be the same thing as talking to all the communities, but it's kind of we prioritize doing deeper engagement rather than doing broader engagement. So this plan, we're still going to include all those elements of a standard watershed plan, especially in the undeveloped areas. So things like opportunities for land protection and freshwater connectivity and restoration opportunities and habitat benefits. But we're also going to try to advance, there we go. We're also going to look at community-focused elements. So things like accessible green space. There's a great set of data from the Trust for Public Land about how far people are from parks. So we're going to incorporate data like that. Flood protection in urban areas. So how can we absorb stormwater to improve water quality and flood protection? How do we absorb floodwater or stormwater in places that maximize heat island relief? And really critically, we don't know what our community-focused elements are yet. Because if we come in and we say, oh, we know already, we're missing out on all of those benefits that we know we would get if we talked to the communities. And so we have this kind of iterative, adaptive approach where right now we're in project scoping and a little bit into very early spatial planning. But the idea is we started with city overviews. What's the political context? What are the big political issues? Who are the key nonprofit players? Who are the key, who are the biggest employers? What are the demographics? What are the income levels? And so we started just like, what's the context? What don't we necessarily know? Because we wanted to make sure that we are aware of our blind spots. Between our project team, we have people who are very familiar with our focal communities and with the watershed, but we didn't want to assume that we knew everything because we know that we don't know everything. And that's a really important part of our approach is we know that we don't know everything. And so we are actually, the poll is in the field right now. And we are oversampling low-income folks and people of color because we know that those are the people who have been least represented in previous plans. So the poll is in the field now. We'll have some data. We're going to use that data to identify our gaps, identify our blind spots, and then find people to partner with to help us address those blind spots. And we're going to use all that information to develop a really comprehensive, well-informed community engagement plan that we'll then use throughout the rest of the process. Our spatial planning is really the heart of this. We're making a map. We have to have spatial planning. But we're going to incorporate social and natural sciences into the data models. And really critically, we're going to bring the draft models to communities and say, how does this look? Go check this for us. Does this make sense with what you know from living in these communities, from working in these communities? And then we're going to go back. And I tried to do a version of this graph where it like spiraled around and had all the feedback loops, and it got insane, so I didn't do it. So imagine the feedback loops. But we have things that we're ground truthing with community members, we're circling back, and we're updating our maps. And then eventually, we're going to get to this point where we have near final maps. We're going to bring them out to communities to make sure that it's something that people who may want to use them know how to access and use them. And also, we're going to make recommendations for anybody funding work in the Merrimack watershed of how to make sure that their funding for the projects and the areas that end up as priorities in this map are equitable and effective and actually can turn into changes on the ground. So that was a lot of information. Before we dive into nitrogen pollution, it looks like we have a question. But anybody have questions? And if we're a small enough group, feel free to pop off mute. Questions, comments, thoughts. I'm gonna grab some water.
Yeah, any questions?
Well, Emma, I just put it into the chat that what you've just described is exactly what the MVP grant application that we're putting together right now is proposing to do.
Awesome.
You've provided a beautiful template and explanation of what we're hoping to do within the Nashua River watershed with a number of the people that are on the call.
Amazing.
So thanks so much for articulating it so beautifully. Thank
I'll
you.
send the slides. And also, the Nashua River watershed is in the Merrimack, so let's talk.
Absolutely.
We're tributary.
Yeah.
We are, but of course the MVP program is mostly, is focused on Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And therefore the portion of our watershed that's in Massachusetts doesn't actually include any of the 4 urban areas that you've mentioned.
That's okay. We'll still. Yeah. I do a lot of work with MVP community, like a lot of the Mill Creek and Belle Isle, which we didn't talk about, work is all funded by MVP, or at least funded by MVP, originally planned by MVP grants that have then been leveraged into other things. So MVP has been absolutely game changing. Also, in case you aren't up on the governor's schedule, which I usually am not, she announced MVP 2.0 today. So MVP 2.0 is going to center community and equity even more than the original version. There's more opportunities for technical support. So very cool stuff coming out of MVP as well. We are not doing a lot of PFAS work. We know that there's a ton of people doing PFAS work. One of the blessings and occasional challenges of working in Massachusetts is there's so many environmental organizations that sometimes we pick a lane and talk to our partner organizations of like, hey, do you need our backup on this PFAS thing, or do you need our backup on this particular issue? And so we have not done a lot with PFAS. Unfortunately, the nature-based solutions side of things, there's some preliminary evidence, I think, that PFAS might be phytoremediated a little bit, so like broken down by plants, but mostly it's not. So it's not particularly something that we're able to address, but in theory, if you can infiltrate more water, you get less of it goes straight to surface water, but then you still have PFAS in your soil. PFAS is tricky. I don't know how to fix PFAS. I wish I did, but nobody does. Anything else?
Other questions?
Yeah.
I just want to mention one thing that I forgot to mention. Emma Lord is on this call also from the National Park Service, and glad to have her here also. So, yes, continue.
Awesome. So we are going to pivot a little bit, but it's still very related to stormwater, where we were talking about kind of how do you get more nature-based solutions into communities in ways that work. This is also a very different tricky issue. We're going to go down to the Cape. So hope it's not a Friday afternoon, because then we'll sit in traffic for hours, but on a Wednesday afternoon, we might be okay, especially virtually going to the Cape. As you may know, harmful algae blooms are an increasing dramatic problem across the Northeast, and unfortunately, not just across the Northeast, across huge parts of the developed world. And these are not just gross and smelly, they're really dangerous and they're really expensive. And so we talk a lot about the, the economic impacts. So tourism, water treatment. There's also social and cultural kind of way of life intangible impacts to people who live on the Cape for access to beautiful water who can't anymore. It's the ancestral and current home of the Mac-Wampanoag tribe, and they're really committed to working to make this better, and also have really limited power to make change because they don't have that much power on the Cape. And so this comes back to partnership, bringing together experts from across a huge range of expertise, because we know that nutrient overloads harm people and nature and culture and economy. And we also know that when you add a whole bunch of extra nutrients and you make it really warm, you get even worse problems. So climate change and nutrient pollution are just way worse than the sum of their parts. And this is kind of a too much of a good thing situation. And in a lot of places, a lot of the nutrient overloads are coming from stormwater. On the Cape, a ton of it is actually coming from wastewater, but nutrient overload harms ecosystems, harms people. This is back to the same thing of you can't separate people and nature. People and nature are completely intertwined, and climate change just makes all of it significantly harder. And so when we go to the Cape, as I mentioned, about 80% of the controllable nitrogen sources on the Cape come from septic systems. And so this is a pivot from a stormwater, but I'll get back there, I promise. Septic systems were designed because we knew that bacteria and pathogens are bad, and that we needed to remove them before they went back into groundwater. And so they weren't really including or thinking about how do you remove nutrients, because it wasn't on our radar when we were developing septic systems. And so septic systems do a really good job of keeping bacteria and other like viruses and pathogens. Don't quote me on this, I know it's recorded, but there's some preliminary evidence that some PFAS might get remediated out of some higher level septic systems, but that's all rumor. Don't believe me on that, but some emerging contaminants do get removed in better septic systems, but standard septic systems don't do enough. And the entire Cape, basically, the entire Southern Cape is impaired for nutrients. And so this basically means that the entire southern part of the Cape is facing acute challenges thanks to nitrogen pollution. And unfortunately, there's no silver bullets. If there were silver bullets, we would have fixed this by now. So we need a combined approach for really rapid, like we need to do this yesterday, cost-effective nitrogen reduction that actually meets communities' needs. So I'm going to focus on nature-based approaches for the rest of our time together, but better septic is a really, really critical part of this. We now have septic systems that can remove nutrients down to close to the same nutrient concentrations as you have coming out of wastewater treatment plants. So we have better septic systems. They're expensive, and we need to figure out how we pay for and manage them better. And I'm doing a ton of work on that. And if you have questions about it, we can talk about it literally for hours. But better septic is part of the solution. More sewer is part of the solution in places where sewer makes sense and is cost effective. Figuring out how we reduce nitrogen sources. So this is things like fertilizer reduction, not using the bathroom less. It's kind of hard to do source reduction when it's wastewater. But nature-based approaches also can be really, really promising to address nitrogen pollution, and also, as we've been talking about with nature-based solutions, bring a whole bunch of other benefits to the communities where they are. So cranberry bogs, famous part of Cape Cod, it's not economically feasible to really farm them anymore. They just are, it's way cheaper to grow large square cranberry bogs out in flat places out west of here. And so a lot of the cranberry bogs on the Cape are being retired. And a lot of times they're retired and turned into things that aren't super nature-based. But I'm working on a project right now with the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition, EPA, Massachusetts, EPA, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Restoration. Sorry, I lost what the E and the R were there. Mass DER and a whole bunch of other partners to turn a retired cranberry bog into a nutrient sponge. And this is a really promising location because of where it is and the fact that, like a lot of cranberry bogs, it used to be a wetland. Cranberry bogs are, so like blueberry barrens up in Maine, they're actual, like, they grow like that. They're truly wild. Cranberry bogs are really, really heavily altered systems. And so often they're on historic wetlands, but they're layered with a whole bunch of sand. They have a bunch of trenches and irrigation channels gone through them. But this one, it's at the site where groundwater rises to the surface. This is thermal imagery in like July, and this light blue is like 55-degree water coming to the surface. So this is groundwater, which on the Cape, we know basically all the groundwater is incredibly nutrient rich. They pulled radar on a sled, like a radar gun on a sled, and they found peat deposits more than 15 feet deep below the bog surface. So this is, it wants to be a wetland. It is a wetland. It's just covered in a cranberry bog. And so we are working on a restoration that slows the flow of the water to maximize nitrogen reduction. And now there's been a lot of cranberry bogs restored to wetlands, but this is the first one where our explicit goal is nitrogen reduction. And so we're also, in this case, working with the Mashpee-Wampanoag tribe to make sure that the planting plan is really built in to indigenous and cultural species and practices. We're working to make sure that in addition to culturally relevant planting, that we're doing climate resilient planting so that this can be a thriving ecosystem, not just for the month it's planted, but for decades to come. So we're going to put white cedar swamp somewhere in here. We're going to have pedestrian access, a whole bunch of different habitats and ecosystems that go through here. And so just like with the other nature-based solutions that we talked about, this is our primary goal is nitrogen removal, but also this is going to store a whole bunch of water, act like a sponge in those really, really intense rainfall events that we're going to be seeing increasingly common. It's going to be habitat for wildlife in places where they may not have very much. It's opportunities for people to walk. People already walk their dogs around the outside, but there'll be more trails and more access for people to go through. There's questions and conversations about how much this is going to improve or protect stored carbon. We haven't quite figured that out yet, but it's potentially possible there. And it's really cost effective. Ooh, that size got wrong. So this is 2019 data. A couple of things have happened in the world since 2019. So don't look at the numbers, just look at the trends here. We had an analysis done that found that all of these things are really important. They all have their space, but that cranberry bog restoration can also be an incredibly cost-effective way to remove nitrogen from the water and bring all of these benefits to the surrounding communities. So this is yet another example of nature-based solutions. This one is less explicitly like community-driven because the community immediately surrounding it is pretty supportive of it, but it's not in as densely packed of a community. But we're still going to bring benefits to a huge number of people and to nature and our coastal ecosystems. So this is, as I promised, another picture of that MBTA bridge that will get replaced. Don't worry if you take the commuter rail. But yeah, if you have any questions, let me, 1 second, get back to where the questions are. But yeah, what questions do you all have? Or thoughts or things that you want to talk about?
Okay, so Paula mentions parts of the National River have been closed by the local Board of Health due to toxic algae blooms. Out here, I think phosphorus is actually the nutrient that is most troublesome in our waters. Yeah, a lot of things need addressing, and the nutrient problems are a big deal for us.
Yeah, in general, so the reason that Cape Cod nitrogen is such a big deal is in general, freshwater phosphorus is a bigger is a limiting nutrient, and in saltwater nitrogen is a limiting nutrient. So on the Cape, we talk about nitrogen because the coasts are having the massive algae blooms. Unfortunately, the ponds are also having massive algae blooms. That's phosphorus. So the nitrogen and the phosphorus tend to go together. There's very few things that just do one of them. So they tend to be partnered. That's why I try to talk about nutrients instead of nitrogen or phosphorus, but I slip into one or the other fairly frequently.
But nutrients of the nitrogen must affect drinking water very much.
Yeah.
Thing on the Cape, yeah. It would be problems. Okay, Lisa, do you have a question you want to? We have the ability to have people ask their own questions, which is kind of exciting. Usually we don't. Lisa, do you want to mention your comment?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I apologize. I was just wondering, we had an algae bloom in our town recently, and the town declined to really do anything about it. And I'm wondering if algae blooms are always an issue, or if there's some reason that they didn't test it, or are there tests that need to be done? How are those things addressed?
Yeah, so there's you can actually just look at them under a microscope and see what they are most of the time. They're not that, like, they're significantly bigger than like bacteria and viruses. So there are algae blooms that are more and less harmful. The cyanobacteria tend to be the ones that bring the most toxins. I don't know the full array of testing. I know that there is testing. I also know that once you have a bloom, there's not that much you can, like, prevention is the best cure, and once you have a bloom, you just kind of have to stay out of it. So if they posted to stay out of it, that might have been all they could do.
Actually, they did not post to stay out of it. They said that it was November and it would freeze and be done.
I mean, I might have done something different, but yeah, the November algae blooms are also, those are a fun sign of climate change. We used to have a season for algae blooms.
Right. Well, November, you probably don't have to post them because not too many of us go swimming in
that
November.
That may have been the logic.
Other questions? There must be some things that are on your minds. Got a few minutes here. Well, I was infiltration. I was glad you were talking about the need for infiltration, because that's a big deal out here also. And because of the streams and not only reducing flooding, but the small streams and the wetlands that are driving our biodiversity are drying up in the summers and creating a reservoir of groundwater is one of the goals we're aiming at.
And I mean, I think that's something that doesn't really get talked about as much as like we talk a lot about infiltration in the sense of flood reduction, right? Like if you're infiltrating, you're not flooding as much. But infiltration for groundwater recharge is so critical, because that's what's going to give us, as we get more, like a higher percentage of our rainfall in really intense events, we're going to get these long gaps between. And so we need to be recharging our aquifers and recharging our groundwater. And there's the really interesting thing is, like, I talked about kind of there's no such thing as a one size fits all solution. Nature-based solutions, we're constantly like calibrating, like, okay, well, if we really want maximum infiltration, we do this thing. If we really want maximum kind of cooling, we do something else. But also there's places where infiltration is tricky, because if you have like a really impervious, maybe heavily salted, or like a parking lot, you don't necessarily want to fully infiltrate everything from the parking lot, because you can get groundwater contamination. It depends on where your downstream wells are. This is where like you just get down spirals. But the answer is infiltration is good. You just got to be careful about what layers of infiltration you're putting in.
Right. Let's see, John Brush, you have a question?
I just wondering if, in all the work you've been doing down the Cape, where the Otis Air Force Base and all the pollutants, plumes that are coming out of that are impacting any of the studies that you're doing.
I know that there is a lot of work happening. I'm not involved in any of that, and it hasn't been something that we've really talked about directly, but I know that that's a topic of a lot of conversation for a lot of the really Cape focused organizations.
Okay. Yeah, because I don't know specifically, but living up here near Devon's, I know there's certainly stuff that's unpleasant in that area too that's impacting. I'm not sure. I'm relatively new with the NRWA, but I know we're tracking some of that, and I'm just interested how that all,
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Cape Cod Commission has some information about that on their website. They have a huge wealth of information, and I wouldn't be surprised if they have some stuff about Otis and pollution.
Yeah.
So I know, that's who I would go to find more information. And I see Paula's question about kind of auxiliary dwelling units and increasing basically housing density. And this is one of the things that I get really nerdy thinking about. Of housing affordability is a absolute crisis right now, right? Like we know that we don't have enough housing, and we know that the way that we're developing right now is creating more problems that makes life worse for people. So how do we balance the need for more housing with the need to do this well? And that's honestly where my nature-based solutions soapbox come in. If you're going to pave over a backyard and fill an entire lot with a house, whether it's one house or two houses, it's going to be in a place where you're on septic and you're on an old septic system that isn't being maintained. Yeah, that's going to be a problem. If you're able to do it in ways where you're infiltrating your roof runoff and you're making sure that you're connected to really, effective wastewater systems, whether it's better septic or it's sewer, whether, building in and requiring more nature on these lots can be a way to balance that. So, I mean, I love the idea of like, oh, you're going to build an auxiliary dwelling unit. Well, you have to upgrade your septic system or connect to sewer. and you have to have a green roof, and maybe a rain barrel, and a rain garden.
Yeah.
And so I think that finding that balance is really important. And depending on where you are and what size the lots are, the way that works is different. But figuring out ways to have to make it not an either or between affordable housing and a livable environment is really, really important, because once we make that be a tension, the environment's going to lose. People need places to live. People need to be able to afford housing. When we can show we can do this in ways that make people's lives and their day-to-day lives better, and we're building a better future, that's where we win. And that's where the multiple benefits come in.
And how about porous pavement for parking lots? I know there's been studies. I think we've had actually an implementation up here at Walden Pond, but I don't know how far spread it's going. Be curious about that.
So actually, I might put Pallavi on the spot, but you don't have to. If you stay on mute, I won't put you on the spot. There's promise in it. There's places, again, where it works and places where it doesn't. And I see Pallavi went off mute. You want to talk about porous pavement?
Sure. So you're right. They have been doing a lot of research in terms of how effective porous pavement is, and they're, roughly speaking, two basic, or I should say three basic kinds of porous pavement. I think the Walden Pond has utilized, if I'm not wrong, the pavers, which essentially has these, when the pavers come together, they have these grooves through which the water can infiltrate into a sub base that essentially stores the water and gradually lets it infiltrate. The second type, if you will, of porous pavement is either porous concrete or porous asphalt. And both of these are being used pretty commonly now, I should say. The only issue being that they have to be periodically vacuum swept. And at CRWA, I was involved with doing a pilot project for porous asphalt. And the logic there is the pieces of kind of rocks or gravel in the asphalt are huge, and they don't have any fines mixed in. So it's possible for the water to just go through that asphalt and then again be stored in the base underneath. So in areas where maintenance has been pretty periodic or regular, it's worked really well. But in areas like Walden Pond, I hear anecdotally that, DCR hasn't been that great about sort of making sure that there is periodic, vacuum sweeping or some way of sort of making sure that the holes are sort of still working effectively, that there could be some ponding. But I'd say at this point, we've done a few different kinds of pilot projects, and it seems to be a really good way to achieve the phosphorus reduction as well as other storage goals, especially because we have so many parking lots everywhere, and it's definitely a very viable solution.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Pallavi.
Sure.
One of the other key pieces to success in building nature-based solutions, and all of the things that all of us work on, is when you know that one of the leading experts in these things is on the call, don't try to give an answer when
You're too kind.
and knows more things about it than you do.
Thanks.
Okay, well, we're a little past 5, so we should be wrapping this up unless it's something really urgent. We should call it a day. And a great presentation, a lot of really good things to think about. I love the notion of, broadening your thinking whenever you're doing any kind of project as to what are the pieces that can balance out the pieces that aren't as good environmentally. That's an important way to think about everything. And a lot of good stuff. Thank you very much.
And happy to chat with anybody about anything else. I'll make sure that you can get a copy of the slides and my contact information. Also, definitely interested in hearing more about that MVP proposal.
Yeah, great. Yeah, we're enthusiastic about it. I hope the MVP comes through with the funding is. But yeah, it's nice to see them focusing on that kind of a project. It's just good for the world, and I'm glad they're getting there.
MVP is so cool. Great. Well, thank you, everybody.